Have you ever noticed that the three greatest crises in American history happen to be spaced roughly 80 years apart? Let me show you. The American Revolutionary War, plus 80 years, you basically get the Civil War. Plus 80 years, you basically get World War II. Plus 80 years, and you get the modern day.
I'm Papyrus Pundit. In this episode, I'm going to be discussing a philosophy of history, a grand theory that claims to know what drives history. I'm always skeptical of these hedgehog-style theories because they're basically self-reinforcing, like political ideologies. Let's see if you can resist its attraction. The American Revolution crisis concluded around 1788. Although the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 and the Constitution wouldn't go into effect until 1789, it's actually in 1788 that the Treaty of Alliance would be signed with France, and America's Constitution is actually ratified. America's security at that point is no longer threatened. In other words, the crisis ended. Now, many things of importance happened in the intervening years between the Revolution and the Civil War, such as the Transcendental Awakening and those arsons who got away with burning down the White House, but ultimately, it's about 72 years later that the Union will fight the Confederacy. The Civil War lasts for 5 years, from 1860 to 1865, and although it concluded in 1865, the real turning point of the Civil War crisis is in 1864, during the Atlanta Campaign, when victory for the Union is very nearly assured. So that's the number I'll use to count with. So from the end of the American Revolution crisis in 1788 to the end of the Civil War crisis in 1864, we get a total of 76 years in between those two crises. Now we have Reconstruction and some Cuba invasion stuff, the Panama Canal, etc. And by the time America is back on the world stage, suddenly a European war breaks out and America plays a side role for most of that show. The Roaring '20s are great, especially for America, and we seem to have escaped history. But then in 1929, it all came crashing down. The Great Depression, which started in America, spreads to the whole world. It's at least partially responsible for the rise of Hitler. Although it would have seemed inconceivable just a few years earlier, the entire world goes to war for a second time. I've always thought of it as being a civil war of Western civilization itself. Our nation was reborn in World War II. In fact, World War II is America's first major external crisis since the Revolution. Although World War II technically ended in 1945, it is basically in the bag for the Allies by late 1943, and any question of Germany or Japan coming away with a win is over by the late summer of 1944. So 1944 is the year I'm going to use to count with. So between the end of the Civil War crisis in 1864 and the end of the Depression/World War II crisis in 1944, we get a period of 80 years.
From all the remote places where he had traveled, from all the scattered battlefields, he returned home again to find a soldier's welcome.
After World War II, the GIs come home and make a lot of babies, which is why we call these babies the baby boomers. In fact, it didn't just happen in America. It happened in many countries around the world. In a sense, these are the children for whom all those brave men fought and died for. The oldest baby boomers are now about 80 years old, which also happens to be the length of time that has transpired between 1944 and 2023. About 79 years. Okay, so what does it mean that there's a pattern in the number of years between each of these great American crises? Well, it's not a coincidence. 80 years is roughly the length of what the ancients called the saeculum. That's a Roman word. A saeculum is a period of time measured by the birth, life, and death of the oldest members of a single generation. According to Neil Howe, at the dawn of recorded history, the generation, not the year, was the universal standard of social time. In the Hebrew Bible, Genesis measures time with a chain of generations, each begetting and raising the next. Now, it just also happens to be the length of time between one major civilizational crisis and the next. The generation that is entering adulthood at the time that the crisis occurs is the one that must sacrifice the most to stave off disaster. That's the GIs. And that's why it's long been said that the GIs built this country or saved this country. For those of you who have been watching Foundation on Apple TV+, you may have noticed that 150 years pass between each season on that show. As characters race across time to avert each crisis on the show, the pattern of each crisis occurring 150 years later goes largely unexplained.
Threaten the peace and pay a dear price.
On the show, it's called psychohistory, a mathematical model that allows characters to understand how events are likely to unfold in the future. But in the modern day, we actually have some real-life psychohistorians. Their names are William Strauss and Neil Howe, and they devised the Strauss-Howe generational theory. This theory posits that American history is largely driven by recurring generational personas. Each generation has a kind of collective persona or archetype that defines it, and in turn defines how that generation will come to shape history. Every 4 generations, the cycle repeats, which is why our civilization is experiencing a new great crisis every 80 years or so. Maybe you don't think America is facing a crisis right now, in which case you've been living under a rock. It is most definitely a crisis, though a very strange one. A perma-crisis, if you will. An endless list of political, economic, and geostrategic problems are stacking up before our very eyes. But when you think about it, that's exactly what the Great Depression and World War II were, as well. Now, if you're not pessimistic about this, that's probably because you're trying to be contrarian. But why this perma-crisis? Why now? In a sense, each of these great American crises has reset the clock back to zero. The rules were rewritten and treaties were signed. New and increasingly just systems were born out of each of these major wars. But as the generations grow and multiply, they fail to pass on certain values and ideas. And according to Neil Howe, it basically takes only 4 generations to go from golden age to disaster. We are now entering a period in which a majority of the population does not have a lot of direct living memories of World War II or the people who fought in World War II. For most youngsters, World War II is just another historical event, like the War of the Roses. The Great Depression is even more obscure. It's passing out of our lived memory and into dry, dusty history books. Remember, the GI generation built this country. The silent generation silently tried to keep up and find their place. The baby boomers, who were primarily the children of the GIs, they've mostly just improved upon what the GIs built. Gen X, who are largely children of the silent generation, they came up during the smaller scale interregnum crisis of the 1970s. They're just lucky to be here. And the millennials, though many of them remember their GI grandparents, haven't exactly inculcated the same values. Now Gen Z, which very often can't answer even the most basic history questions, is now entering the workforce. Who can blame them? I didn't have an AI on my phone that could write term papers for me. Another way of looking at it is that World War II was such a shock to the system of the human race that its lived memory has taken longer to forget, and people have forgotten. A lot of people thought that great power war was inconceivable until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it's been 80 years since the last great crisis ended. Does that mean this one is over as well? 2008 was like an opening salvo. Trump and COVID have been like some kind of bizarre middle act. But what's the third act of this new great American crisis going to be like? Well, according to Neil Howe, we should expect the third act to be over one way or another by 2033. Why? Wait, you might say. You said it was averaging 80 years between each crisis. Well, yes, I did. But remember that through modern medicine, human lifespans have been increasing. The GIs, the silent generation, and the baby boomers have all had extended lifespans in comparison to their 19th century counterparts. Side note, that's why the Seculum period on Foundation is 150 years, because it's the future and people live longer, so the cycle takes longer to play out. There are quite a few problems with this big hedgehog theory. One thing I noticed this theory doesn't quite address is the concept of a black swan event. For instance, a massive earthquake that destroys entire cities, or a meteor, or perhaps 9/11. Oh, but no, one could argue, 9/11 was caused by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda draws its roots from the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden, who were trained and funded in the 80s by the United States to fight the Soviets. See what I did there? Is that a good argument? Maybe, maybe not. But 9/11 and the Forever Wars have always struck me as an unwelcome sequel or repetition of the Vietnam era. It perfectly coincides with the unraveling that Strauss and Howe predicted in their first book, which was published in the 90s. Many people say that generations don't exist, or that the dates we use to measure when one is born or are imprecise or simply made up. In that case, I refer you to both of these books. I will, however, read some fast quotes. Generations, unlike most other social categories, possess their own personal biography. You can tell a lifelong story about the shared experiences of the silent generation in ways you never could for all women, all Hispanics, or all Californians. Every generation is born, lives, and dies. It can feel nostalgia for a unique past, express urgency about a future of limited duration, and comprehend its own mortality. A lot of millennials and Gen Z are unemployed and living with their parents, just as the GI generation were during the Depression. Millennials have grown up into and entered adulthood during endless economic stagnation coupled with toxic social upheaval and the return of great power conflicts. The GI generation didn't exactly have a great reputation either before World War II. But after World War II, we view them as heroic. These were young citizens who rose to meet the challenges of the moment. Baby boomers, on the other hand, were born during the golden age of the late 1940s and 1950s, when our country had strong, decisive leadership and massive economic growth. They were basically spoiled, although don't let them hear you say that. Gen X was born during periods of upheaval like the Consciousness Revolution and Vietnam, just as Gen Z was born during the forever wars of the 2000s and the Great Recession. Being born during these periods has had a massive effect on their psychology. These generational archetypes form a kind of average personality and behavioral pattern that is at least mostly true for each generation. When this is over, according to Neil Howe in 2033, I think it'll be morning in America again. But how? That seems impossible that things could get better. Optimistic people are just being contrarian, right? But remember that peace in our time seemed impossible in 1939, and just 6 grueling years later, our country was born anew. The same thing can happen again. In 2023, we have left-wingers versus right-wingers in today's Permac Crisis. In each case, the division needed to reach fever pitch before the crisis could be resolved. In each case, it's not so much that one side beat the other that we should remember, but that the nation was reborn, restarted its clock, and people were able to start making real lasting changes to the country for the first time in decades. Right now, everything is polarized and gridlock rules Washington, but I think big and lasting changes, whether they be just or dystopian, are inevitable in the coming years because of the momentum of the cycle. The funny thing about the Strauss-Howe generational theory is that it doesn't tell us how to solve the crisis. That's your job. What do we need to do to save this country? Let me know in the comments. Do you agree with this generational theory of American history? Do you believe that history is a repeating cycle? The 2024 election cycle is exactly 80 years after the climax of World War II, and I can already see quite a few ways 2024 could develop into a massive internal civil conflict. I'm Papyrus Pundit. If this video gave you food for thought, please consider subscribing. Don't worry about offending people, least of all me. Just tell me what you think.